Welcome. My name is Richard Cunningham. I'm President and CEO of the Markham Board of Trade, and thank you for joining us today. I'm here representing actually the York Region group of chambers, of which the Vaughan Chamber of Commerce, Newmarket Chamber of Commerce, and the Richmond Hill Board of Trade are members of a 9 group that work together very closely, and we're here today to present some information about COVID-19, which is an issue that is impacting many of our business members, where there's lots of questions, and the issues are changing hour by hour. I'm joined by Ron Minken of Minken Employment Lawyers. Thank you for being with us today. So Ron, there's been an awful lot of questions from our members around York Region and business owners, and of course things are changing minute by minute. So I think these questions are going to be very valuable to our business constituents. The first question we have is general workplace safety. As an employer, what are my responsibilities?
Well, the law governing this, Richard, is the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario. And essentially, this ensures that workers work in a safe environment, a safe workplace. So the obligation is on the employer to ensure that the workplace is safe for their employees. And this could include a number of things, and certainly it would include providing information to those workers, perhaps information as to the risks of contracting COVID-19.
So Ron, given the current situation and as an employer, what can one do to make sure that their workplace is safe?
It's a good question, Richard. There's actually a number of things. We've compiled a list, and there's 8 things we thought of that are quite important, and we think this really applies to almost every employer to do. So number 1 would be, first of all, if you're sick, what should you do? Stay at home from work. It's not rocket science, and especially if you happen to have a fever. That's number 1. Number 2, washing hands well with soap and water. And this isn't a few second thing. This should be at least a 20-second experience or more. There's some very good actually information that we've seen from different groups as to how this is done properly.
And there's some great songs I understand that you can sing to do this.
That's right. Third one is social distancing. So, when you came in the office, did we shake hands or not? I won't say. Do you do the toe tap, the 2-step together of the elbow? So all part of social distancing is keeping that distance as one may be used to doing or not. But that includes shaking hands, how close one is in an office or in the room. When they're sitting together, are they 3 feet apart? Are they side by side? Or do you keep a bit more distance? So the distancing is proper. Now, people do cough, and that doesn't necessarily mean that one has COVID-19 if they cough. So what happens at that point? Well, of course, it should be pretty obvious to some, but maybe not all, that if you're coughing, you want to cover your hand with a tissue or cough in the in part of your elbow. Don't use your bare hand. Use a tissue, because what happens in the bare hand, I'm going to grab my coffee mug and maybe hand it over to you, or my phone to you, or the stapler, and what's going to happen? That you can contract whatever I have if I happen to have something, which I don't, for the record. So another good point would be, keeping hands away from nose and mouth. People have sometimes a habit of touching their face or scratching or rubbing it. And the key thing is keep your hands to yourself. And yourself means off your eyes, off your face, off your nose, and off your mouth. Another good point would be when you touch surfaces, for example, door handles, be careful there. Are they cleaned regularly? Make sure they are cleaned regularly. Countertops in the boardroom table, telephone, or even your cell phone. What happens, you put your phone maybe down on someone else's table that's not clean, and then infections can happen. So making sure one's meticulous in keeping things clean. And other things would be, what about computer keyboards? What about sharing computer keyboards, sharing phones, sharing books, papers, and pens? So those things you want to be careful about as well. And the last thing would be if you have a fever, a cough, or any difficulty in breathing, seek medical attention. There's different lines that the government has set up for this purpose, medical lines, and you also want to disclose your travel history. It doesn't help to not inform people that you've been to different countries on the list that are published as to ones that have a high risk. So inform them, inform your employer, as well as inform your doctor if you've been to those places.
I would think especially these days with the new work environments, people are hoteling, they're getting different desks, different places to work each time they come into work. Those are going to be even more of a challenge for the employers to keep them clean. And unlike the past, when we come in and have our own sort of work area and workstation, and we were the only ones really touching it. Do I need to close my business? This is a question a number of our members have been asking us.
Well, that's a good question. So, Richard, the analysis would be, is my workplace safe? And, how do we determine if the workplace is safe? Well, as we know, every workplace is different, whether it's a police station per se, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a sanitation place or an office. So really, the analysis is a case-by-case analysis. It's really dependent on the nature of your business, your location. It's not an easy analysis to do, and in each business, the answer may be different.
I guess now some of these questions have been answered for us now that the Premier has declared a state of emergency in Ontario. Many workplaces are being forced to close, or in the cases of restaurants, they have to do takeout or delivery. So this takes some of the onus off owners as to whether they would need to close their business. If I don't close my business and I remain open and I'm not covered under the current situation the Premier's declared, do I have any liability as an employer if people come into work and one of them might get sick?
So Richard, those are good questions. And you mentioned Premier Ford made the announcement declaring Ontario a state of emergency. And that's timely because in some ways that's made it easy for those businesses to know what to do. But what if you're not included under the umbrella of what Premier Ford discussed? Well, certainly the test is, or the analysis is my workplace safe? Have I ensured safety of the workers? In certain situations, you cannot ensure safety. Other situations you can. So what should an employer do? Well, we discussed basic things that are good suggestions, good points for employees to follow. As to cleanliness, make sure that they're clean, the workplace is clean. So certainly those sort of notifications should go out to employees to follow. So that's number one thing that a business could do in helping ensure a safe workplace. Now, what are other things they could do? Well, it is a case-by-case analysis. So if we consider, what does the company do? What does the business do? Because when you look at interaction, the key thing is, social distancing, minimizing interaction. And where do you see interaction? Well, in a business, interaction would be between the workers and their customers and their clients. And it could be a store, it could be an office where customers, clients would come in those premises. Or it could be among employees themselves. So an employer may want to consider limiting interaction with respect to customers and people who visit the workplace. And how do you limit interaction? Well, it could be encouraging perhaps working at home in certain circumstances. It could be telephone meetings, meetings by Skype or Zoom to meet, other methods. So the analysis again is, what can one do to ensure the safety? And now, what if it's a place that has international travel? That's going to be treated differently. Maybe the front door of the building or entrance door should say, if you've traveled to countries that are listed in the ones that where there is high risk, then you do not enter unless you've been quarantined for 2 weeks. So there are a lot of steps an employer can do. Essentially, putting a notification at the front door, putting rules into place with respect to customers coming in that still allows you to conduct business and carry on business. Now, the next point is to your being with other employees. What if an employee has returned from a country on the list of high risk? Then it's that employer's obligation to get information, get a directive out there that employee should not return to work. They should be quarantined for at least 2 weeks. So there are things that the employer can do to ensure the safety without having to close their business. But essentially, if the employer does nothing, then the safest thing, yes, close your business up.
I noticed today when I came here that you've got the notice on your front door, and it's well laid out to talk about if you've had international travel, and so you're following your own rules.
We do, Richard, actually. And I'm glad that you reviewed those.
I did,
and
very
after you reviewed
carefully.
those, I'm glad that you were able to come in. And you may have noticed after you came in, you were asked those same questions by someone else. So we have a two-tier due diligence, two-tier level of going through that, and we're glad that they let you in.
Work refusal is another question that we've heard from our members. What can I do if an employee claims it's unsafe to come to the work and they want to stay at home?
Well, the employee may be able to refuse work. So the first thing you'd need to do is, and it would be an employer's duty, would be to conduct an investigation. Is there merit for what the employee is saying or not? So two circumstances where the employee could be able to refuse work is, what if you said that I would like you, sir, madam, to go to a certain country internationally, which is where we have the travel restriction. Could the employee say no? That's one potential area. The other would be, what if someone has just returned from work internationally, and the employer has taken no steps to isolate or quarantine that worker? Then the employee could perhaps then be right in refusing to work because of the potential to contract COVID-19 from this other worker.
A question about traveling, which is an interesting one. An awful lot of international companies have told their employees that they're not to travel any longer outside of the country, in fact, not even within the country. I'm wondering what happens if I'm an employee, I have traveled outside of my usual work area, and the travel bans go into place, and now I'm stuck in a location, in a hotel or an Airbnb. Is the employer responsible for my costs in staying there?
That's a great question, Richard. And this isn't a question we discussed before this interview. And as a lawyerly answer, it depends. I would think a good employer would want to pay that bill. Now, if you said, hey, I think I need a week in Fiji, or a month in Fiji, Fiji's not on the list.
Right.
Maybe you and I will go to Fiji. So it would depend. I mean, if it's reasonable, then I would say, and the employer is stuck, well, yes, it would be an obligation, I believe, on that employer to catch that bill, providing the bill is reasonable and what's on it's reasonable, and the liquor tab is low.
They're working within the constraints of whatever policy they have in travel.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
When can I insist that an employee stay in the workplace? Or can I insist that they stay in the workplace?
Well, Richard, there's certain times that you can. So, for example, a police officer, a firefighter, if your home is getting broken into or a fire starts, these are essential services. So the key thing is employees who do work in industries where these services are essential, an employer can insist that they stay at work. Let's think of other areas as well. What about food? People need food. Now, the issue with food is when people get hired on by a grocery chain, let's say, they haven't taken on any inherent risk in that job. It's not a job that has that. So in that situation, an employer probably could not insist that that employee continue. They can present the option to that employee to, if they wish to stay, they're certainly able to. And if that employee agrees, I certainly hope that the employer pays a bit more to that employee. Or they can hire at that stage employees, but they must make clear the risk that's inherent with the job. So once they've done that, then the employee accepts the employer's offer. Then if the employer were to refuse based on it not being safe, well, they knew that coming into it. So those are situations where an employee would likely not be able to refuse. So Richard, the key thing is an employee cannot refuse work if it would threaten the life, the health, or the safety of another worker. Now, another point too is, what should an employer do if the request is unreasonable? Well, you'd never want to, if that employer has already made that request, you'd never want to sanction them or discipline them for so doing.
The unfortunate part about this kind of a situation that we all find ourselves in these days is that Employers are having to try and keep their business alive, even though business, of course, will be very greatly reduced. Employees need to keep their jobs because they need to put food on the table and pay their mortgage. But there comes a time when, unfortunately, you may have to end employment on the part of an employer's side. What are my options, or what are employers' options for ending the employment relationship with an employee if they actually have to do that?
Well, in that circumstance, Richard, if your employees can work at home and do so, effectively and efficiently, then of course you should likely permit that and of course pay them. But what if they can't? Are you obligated to pay your employee if it's not practical for them to work at home? Then no, you're not. So we do have job protection in certain circumstances. Now, what if the employee is ill? Well, then the employer would be able to receive employment insurance. But essentially, if that employee, if that worker, it's not practical for them to work at home, then, and you do send them home, then you would not have to pay them.
So a number of our members are in the retail, manufacturing, and restaurant service businesses. I'm sure this next question is going to be of very big importance to all of them. And each part of that is separate in that some of those cases are mandated and some are not. So let's start with the general question, and that is, am I required to pay employees who are working from home?
Well, in that workplace, if the employees are able to do their regular work and regular duties at home, then you'd likely want them to do that at home, and of course you'd need to pay them, yes.
And what about a case where they've been mandated? We just had the state of emergency position put in place by the provincial government, meaning that restaurants now can only do takeout. So employees who were servers in the past or baristas, now they can't do their job. So those people are going to have to be laid off. What happens to the employer in that case?
So Richard, in a situation, if they've been mandated, which means they're not really permitted to work at the workplace, then they would have to go home. Of course, you wouldn't want to terminate or do anything to trigger that, where it could be perceived that you were terminating. So this is where good legal advice is very important.
Yeah.
Basically, if the employee then goes home, then technically, under the laws today, they wouldn't get paid. So that's a bit of a conundrum. And currently, if you have an employee today or last year that's ill, you send the employee home. Do they get paid or not? Well, you look at your sick leave policy, and there's also the Employment Standards Act. Under the Employment Standards Act, they're entitled to 3 days of job protection, and the employer would not pay. They could get their EI. So generally speaking, if that employee is not ill and you've been mandated, the employees go home, no, they don't get paid.
Well, hopefully either the provincial government or the federal government are looking at plans to have EI cut in earlier, maybe not have a wait period, and we'll pick up where the employer can't pay them themselves.
Now, I believe that's already in process. The 1 week waiting period is to be eliminated, and the other step I think is being addressed. We'll have to see.
We'll have to see. The other issue would be the one where it's not mandated. So I'm in a manufacturing facility, for example, and I can't get enough supplies in to continue to manufacture, or the companies that I'm dealing with aren't looking for the product that we are manufacturing, and I need to do some layoffs because the entire economy may be slowing down and the demand for what I'm producing isn't there any longer. What's the impact of that, and what's my responsibility to those employees that I'm laying off?
Well, when you say laying off, you mean terminating? Because a layoff and a termination are really two different things. So if you do terminate, then one would have to provide notice or pay in lieu of notice under the Employment Standards Act, unless you've had a good contract that limits your notice to only that, then you're looking at common law notice. So if indeed the employees can't work at home, it hasn't been mandated, and you're in a situation where there's been business has spiraled down, lack of sales or whatever, then you would then terminate the employees and, of course, be stuck with, well, the laws in this country are quite favorable to employees, especially
Right.
with notice periods. So you'd like to be stuck with some, quite large notice payments to your employees.
Well, let's hope that isn't the situation and it's more a layoff than a termination, because we certainly will have to come out with the other side of this at some point, and hopefully these people will all be brought back into work.
And of course, with the layoff, you can only do that if your contract of employment allows for it. It's got to be in the contract or it's got to be implied. And this is a very touchy area, because if you don't do it, if you do it the wrong way, then it's treated like a termination. And if you do lay someone off, then it's for 13 weeks, and then the option is, do you then recall them after or not? If you don't recall, then that is a termination. But there's only specific circumstances where you can actually lay someone off.
Ron, I've heard that there may be some sort of job protection. Is that true?
Well, there actually is job protection. These things are always changing, and each industry is different, each situation is different. So really, that's something, and it's a good question, that's something really that the employer should get specific legal advice based on their industry and their workplace.
What are my options for ending the employment relationship with an employee?
So if it's the employer that has made the decision and they want to trigger that, then clearly one is termination. Terminate, you have to pay your ESA notice, your pay in lieu and your severance if applicable, and you'd also have to be common law. That's number one. Number two, it may be considered a temporary layoff. Depends on the circumstances, depends on your industry, and most importantly, is there a contract that permits you to temporarily lay off that employee? At times it could be implied, but this is a very tricky area, and if you can't, then it would be considered constructive dismissal, and you'd have to pay a lot of notice likely to the employee. There's also another issue as to frustration of contract. Now, you can end a relationship if there's frustration. So essentially, if you have a worker who becomes disabled and with no likelihood of ever being able to return to that job, then that would be considered frustration. Now, that's one where you clearly want to get medical evidence. Will this sort of thing qualify as that? I don't think so, but again, it's tough to tell. We're very much in uncharted waters right now, and we're just trying to utilize our experience to kind of foresee what we think will happen in future with the law and the circumstances. But I would say that if an employer were to resort to frustration of contract and then only pay the ESA notice, they would do so with risk, and that's something that certainly they would want to get good guidance from an employment lawyer.
Okay. Actually, with all the technicalities these days employers are facing and employees are challenged with, I think the word frustration can be used quite a bit. Time off. So what if an employee needs time off for illness or to give care to someone who they're related to? What kind of leave would I be required to provide that employee?
So Richard, in that situation, the first thing you'd want to do is look at the sick leave policy. Most companies will have that, they should have that, that outlines what sort of leave a person is entitled to, and usually that's what's with pay. If they don't have that, then the workers would still be entitled to the leave provisions under the Employment Standards Act. So in this situation, if they're sick, they will be entitled to 3 unpaid days. Also, 3 unpaid days too, if they're there to care for certain family members that are ill or suffer a medical emergency. Now, if there is a family member that's critically ill, there's a special provision on that as well. So you look at 2 things. One is your policy. You look at the Employment Standards Act, and if your policy provides a greater benefit, then clearly that the employees would get the benefit of the policy and not only the Employment Standards Act.
I've heard some things on the radio recently in some of the reports, and I understand that employers are likely entitled to require a certificate of good health before the employee returns to the workplace. Is that the case?
Yes, they would be able to require the employee to give them that medical certificate because it's the employer's obligation to ensure a safe workplace. And if they're to do that, then it's important that they know that employee is then well and healthy and ensuring that they won't pass on anything to anyone else. So yes, you can insist on that. And usually comes up is what if they want to leave Can you require the employee or insist that they provide to you a medical note before they leave work? Well, if the purpose of leaving is self-isolation, that would defeat the purpose. So in that case, likely it would not be practical to request that medical note for they to leave the workplace.
Earlier on, we were talking about this next question, which is the Ontario Human Rights Code. What are my obligations as an employer regarding accommodation and prevention of discrimination, Ron?
Well, on the issue of discrimination, you want to make sure that you're not discriminating against any worker based on any of the enumerated grounds in the Human Rights Code. So what's an example? Well, let's say you had an employee who returned from Asia, and you were to insist that they be isolated for 2 weeks, let's say. Would it then be fair to have a worker who was coming from Italy or somewhere from Europe or perhaps the States and not isolate them? So you can't pick one out or discriminate against them based on their ethnicity. So you want to make sure that what you do is fair and compliant with the Human Rights Code. There's also the issue of accommodation, that if someone does need accommodation, the employer has a duty to accommodate up to the point of undue hardship, which means the employer is expected under laws of Canada and Ontario to go through hardship in accommodation, but not undue hardship. So you may think of situations where maybe one is vulnerable and more than others to illness at the workplace. So it may be that you may have to permit that person to go home, whereas others you would not. So those two key issues, discrimination as well as accommodation, are very key. And it's tricky. Again, each workplace is different, and it's a case-by-case analysis. So that's where good legal advice is critical.
Another question that we received was around workers' compensation, and a number of our members will be impacted by this. Is WSIB relevant for employees who are ill or quarantined?
Well, yes, it is relevant, Richard. Most employees do have statutory entitlement to wage loss protection. So if something were to occur out of and in the course of their employment, then they may very well get that compensation. So one can think if they're required to travel, and that traveling was in the course of their employment, or let's say a situation where they're in the health industry and they did, in the course of their employment, contract something, then likely there they would be entitled to wage loss compensation under the Workers' Compensation Act.
Ron, things are changing by the minute. Many things are being mandated by the government and taken out of the hands of employers, and decisions are being made for them. But having said that, what emergency actions can an employer take now? And what should they be doing as an employer to keep their workplace safe?
Well, Richard, an employer should take immediate practical steps to reduce workplace risks associated with COVID-19. Now, there are a number of points that we really want to highlight here that are really key for employers to follow. And so if you haven't listened to any of this interview, you're just tuning in right now, this is the time for this, the vignette time, let's say. So here they are. So number one, ensure that your managers are aware of their duties and obligations under workplace legislation, including the Employment Standards Act, the Ontario Human Rights Code, and the Occupational Health and Safety Act as they relate to COVID-19. Number two, review and update your sick leave policies and policies addressing communicable illnesses, and clarify the protocols that apply to COVID-19. So, Richard, generally these policies should address what illnesses are covered by sick days or short-term disability benefits, protocols for disclosure of both symptoms and travel history, and also protocols for when employees are required to stay at home. And lastly, in there, and the application of paid and unpaid leave entitlements to illness and quarantine-related situations. That was number two. Number three, review and update policies regarding work-related travel, including within North America and within Canada. The fourth point is develop or revise a broader policy to address how business operations will continue in the event of a more serious outbreak or state of emergency. This should outline how core business functions and channels for decision-making will be maintained in such an event. Succession plans for defined roles in the event of short or long-term employee absence, whether and when employees will be expected to work from home, how to communicate with internal and external parties in the event that most employees are telecommuting and are physically absent, how meetings, seminars, conferences, or events that would normally take place in person will be dealt with, and also how the company's facilities will be dealt with in future. And the fifth point and final point would be monitor the latest updates from public health authorities, including municipal, provincial, and federal public health agencies, and the WHO as well, World Health Organization. And there's information, great information in links that should be directed to your employees, as well. Remind them to check these sources. These sources change every day. Also, there's a lot of rumors out there which you don't want to believe, so check and only accept information from reliable sources.
Now, out of all this information that we provided, and a lot of it is we're hearing on the news these days is bad news, have you got any good news for us?
Good news from a lawyer, sure. So the good news would be if the employer works hard and is reasonable at ensuring the health, safety of the worker, and takes reasonable steps, then that will really ensure their business continuity. And then they'll be able to survive this COVID-19 era that we're in.
Ron, thanks so much for giving us your time today, answering these questions, which I know are going to be very helpful to our members and businesses across York Region. And congratulations on 30 years of being in business with Minken Employment Lawyers. I'd also like to thank our other chamber executives from Aurora, Newmarket, Vaughan Chamber of Commerce, and of course the Stouffville Chamber of Commerce in Richmond Hill. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.